This is John Sullivan, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
Yeah, this is cool. We're going to talk about AI and law enforcement. I know John is the expert of experts in the field. He's done this stuff forever at the highest level, and so we had him on a couple of weeks ago talking about cartels and crime in general. But we also have Brad here. There's Brad. Say hi to Brad. Hi, Brad.
Hey, John.
And so Brad is going to help us sort out what reality is within the actual mechanics of writing code and getting a robot to spit out a good answer. And I was just saying off mic, I used a picture from Tom Cruise manipulating the screen in Minority Report for this episode because we envisioned something like this happening, but the reality is that AI is limited in what it can actually do. This is really serious stuff. We already put too many innocent people in prison. And so let's try to figure out what that marketplace looks like. What is possible? What does John need to see? And what does Brad need to tell John about all these things? So fellas, thanks for coming on. I guess, Brad, I want you to start us off and talk a little bit about how you would see AI working in its present form today, and maybe forward cast a little bit like where we might be in, say, 5 years.
Yeah, it might give faster and more plausible answers than we get today. We're using a lot of computing things in law enforcement already that would freak people out. You know, for instance, most police departments have got access to location data on cars that have passed through their cities over the past month. You had no idea you were generating it. If you use a Google Android phone, you probably get a report every month about every place you've traveled. Probably don't even pay attention to it. You know, I pay attention to mine, and I'm scared at the data I generate. But it's, you know, that's available. It's probably being sold. It's probably being purchased, and it's probably placing you at or not at the scene of some crime multiple times a day.
John?
Yeah, let me start out where we were right before we came on the air. AI has been around for a long time in many small ways, and we're just starting to realize where it is. I am concerned because I think a lot of people perceptions, especially law enforcement commanders and people that are not technicians and scientists or have worked in detailed military technology and intelligence technology for years, can appreciate. A lot of what is out there is like, I like it. 3 examples come to mind. The Simpsons show on the monorail. The monorail's coming. We want the monorail. Get it. The next example would be, we think this is Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy with psychohistory, and we're going to be able to predict every single transaction in the entire galaxy of universes. And that's 5,000 years or so in the future in fiction. Or the third, I was reading the current issue of the New Yorker, and there was a cartoon, and there were 2, what I will say look like nerds sitting in front of their computers face to face. And the one nerd says to the other, "Can you change our slide deck from crypto to AI?" Right?
That's great.
And so I say that because AI is real. There's a lot of concern over the use of introduction of biases in AI, and those are valid, real concerns. There's frustration among some less knowledgeable practitioners that the courts are not going fast enough to integrate this technology into the repertoire we can do. The problem is, if you're talking about generative AI, which we know hallucinates, depending upon how you've trained that large language model behind it, it's going to give you a result that is not possible in this universe at times, or is not consistent with the data. And I've done it myself. Been training an AI, give it 2 sets of data on a private side. I don't want it in the wild, and it comes back with results. I'm like, how can you do that? How can you not do it?
Right.
Because it doesn't have context, right? But there's a desire to get there. On the other side, be critical of police, be critical of activists, human rights activists. And I'm not critical of human rights, and I appreciate human rights activists. And there's a great fear about lethal autonomous weapon systems, as there should be, because you need to adhere to international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict to have somebody who's responsible. And how do you make an AI responsible? The only AI robot I see that could plausibly be responsible is Lieutenant Commander Data. And again, he's fictional and not real. So there is great potential and great possibility, and we need to exploit those, but we need to be realistic, and it's going to take time. I've been working on developing these tools since the mid 90s. While I was serving as a deputy sheriff, as a sergeant lieutenant, I worked very closely with Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, Sandia Laboratory, and Los Alamos Laboratory on trying to take these type of tools together to protect people from terrorist threats in what we now call Homeland Security. There are really important, cool tools, but I'll say the things that we were envisioning in the 90s only truly became possible like within the last 3 years, and they're not all there. So we need to work on it. I guess the last anecdote I'll give you, then I'll turn it over to you to get some more dialogue going, was in the late 90s, I was doing a lot of work on developing fate and transport models. That's a fancy way of saying using algorithms to predict the plumes from chemical, biological, radiological weapons. And I was at a conference, and a vendor, and I can't remember who the vendor is, thank God, shows a model and says, this is the model we can use, and shows the fate and transport for a chemical, military chemical agent. I believe it was lewisite. And my response was, what planet did you run this on? Because that's not in our atmosphere. Our physics won't allow that. And it turned out they made a mistake in coding the algorithm. And that happens. We'll talk later about some of the algorithm work I've done to try to do in domestic policing. It has promise. It can be good. It can be better than skilled sergeants, but it's not always accurate. You need somebody in the loop who can say, that's just not right. We need context. And I'll talk more about that later.
Well, I love what you're talking about on the intel side. I've seen a lot of this stuff and the attempts to try to create, data in a way that we could all do our job at analyzing better. And I was more of an operator than an analyst, but that doesn't mean I don't understand these things. And you would have all of these confounding things like, we're going to have a naming convention in Iraq, right? And you're like, okay, but there's unlimited numbers of ways to spell Muhammad. And there's a lot of dudes named Muhammad. They're all 5'6" to 5'8". They all wear sandals. They all have a mustache. If you're going to tell me you've got this hard belief about something that you've pulled out of all this data, it gets imponderable how much shit is in that bag. You're like, how can you guys do anything around here? That's why I like being an operator, because it was just face-to-face, day-to-day. But it's very hard to sort through that stuff. And I know from working with some AI things on the warfighter side, they capture lessons that we know to be incorrect, but they act as if they are correct. And they haven't got the text. It's like you say, well, what's your reference? You ask the thing, what's your reference? And it doesn't say, oh, SIGAR's report 122 says this. It just gives you this theory, big answers that are nowhere near reality, because it can't handle hard, complex things like, what do we do next? What didn't work? Why didn't it work? It doesn't do those things well. And also, again, our need to make things sortable. So Muhammad, Ali, Muhammad, Ali, Muhammad, whatever name you're working with, they all become the same name. And so it's very hard to wrap your hands around a real answer. And it's talking about humans using data, not data being used for humans. Backing up.
Yeah, that's cool.
Let me jump in with two things. One is there's sort of these two biases that we have. One is we like an answer. If in the absence of an answer, we really like an answer. So if something can spit out an answer and it seems plausible, we're often willing to accept it as a workable answer, just without criticism, without thought, without consideration, until a better answer comes along. That's the first thing. Second thing is models. We are somehow hardwired educationally, and I see this in the educated classes. If there's a model, it must be true. And where I saw that come out, with people I know who I thought were smarter than this, was at the beginning of COVID, when they had these spreadsheet models, whoever had them, was it University of Washington or somewhere up in the Northeast or whatever, that said, we're going to have this many people infected and this many deaths, and it's going to It's going to increase like a hockey stick, just like you see in a typical VC presentation. Actually, that would be like this. And all terrible things are going to happen. And so we have to lock down, we have to mask, we have to not talk to our grandparents while they die, blah, 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 blah. All these policy things. And nobody questioned the models. Nobody questioned, hey, where'd this model come from? What are its biases? Is it ever applied before in the real world? Blah, 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 blah. We just don't. We need to get better about that. So those are my two. Those are my two early contributions to this. And then, apply AI and machine learning and everything else to that. And you get, more garbage, basically. You start with garbage.
I think that's a good start. There's a couple things that come to mind. Models are just that. They're models. Yeah. They're not reality. They're abstractions, and they're not complete. I've used models. Models are important. I've had people criticize a model and say you didn't account for that. It's like, I never said it would. It can't. It can only account for this piece. And then people will say, but you have a theory. I said, yes, and I have a complementary theory that explains what you're talking about. Sometimes they go together, sometimes they don't. Models are abstractions. When you talk about decision support, and AI, as we're talking about it now, is primarily going to be used for decision support. It can do other things as well. It can search large bodies of data and pull things out and say, have you seen this? It can use simple algorithms, at the very low end of Bayesian, inference, and say, this, if you said this and that, you must mean this. And if you look at when you type on your iPhone, I do all the time, it makes up words or it's saying things I don't mean because it does not know, but it only knows what it's seen. So it depends upon what large language model you use. But there are two ways you could do this. You could use the data to drive it, large data sets. They used to call it big data. I hated that term. I know why you use it. I know what it means, but it's like, it's a buzzword. We have big data. It's like we have community policing. It's like, do you know what community policing actually is? No, but we have it. So if you want to do dynamic decision making, these models can't get you there. They can maybe tell you, look at this, look at that, but it can't do what a human analyst does. It can queue up things, sort through the data that analysts can't get, because it's not that we don't have the data to everyone. This is the other thing I get upset about, having done counterterrorism intelligence for like 30 years. We're going to connect the dots and prevent the next attack. Well, you can't connect dots for things that haven't happened yet. You can make a hypothesis and test against that, but you can't actually connect them because they're not there. And that's, Pete, you were talking about Minority Report. We're trying to do that. That was a book that became a movie. It was there probably to tell you the lesson of what happens when you try to do that, because it can't really happen. That doesn't mean pieces of it don't. So one way is to use the data to drive it. The other way, which is where the bulk of my work has been, is taking knowledge and expert people to create algorithms based upon expert thought. So you create an ontology. This is what these things mean, and this is how you order them. And if A happens, plus B and C is likely to give you D. There's going to be some Bayesian inference in there, but you have to have experts. And when you do expert things, like I said on one panel doing biosecurity, was supporting a project that they were calling at that time Total Information Awareness. And all the details on that I can't get to. But on the expert panel we had, it was like, I was there. I don't know how I got there, but I was there. And Joshua Lederberg was there. And the notable thing to me is Joshua Lederberg got his Nobel Prize the year I was born. So and it's only one of others. There were many other people there. And like many things, when you get a lot of very smart, educated people, they come together. Like I used to do the Jasons meeting when they were still doing that. I hope they still are. I heard they were going to cut the funding. When you get that level of expertise, you can do very cool things. But they would also bring a guy like me to come in and say, hey, what would happen if this in a real world? What would the operator need? What can an operator see? So when people talk about using these as tools for intelligence analysis, and they can be, and they should be. In fact, I have a company where we're building those tools. So it's not like I don't believe you can do that. So I just believe you have to be very careful. What I think, rather than saying this is going to be the analyst of the future, the robot analyst, I think this is a digital sandbox. This is a place where we can play with ideas. We can say, test this hypothesis, collect that, look at this large stream of data, and let's start prioritizing our requirements and then task them back and ask. So AI is a tool, right? And like, I used to work for a great commander, a guy named Sid Hale. He was a legend. He was a CW5 in the Marine Corps. He was a commander in the Sheriff's Department. I was fortunate. I worked for him 3 times. Sid would say, if the only tool you have is a hammer, all you're going to be able to do is hit the nail, right? You can't do anything else. You have to have a range of tools. And there's more than one type of AI. We talk about it as if it's one thing, and we forget that machine learning is one way of doing it. There's more than one way to do machine learning. The large language models are one. We forget that, pattern recognition, speech recognition, automated license plate readers, those are AI. There's all kinds of different types. I mean, but using the right tool at the right place and mixing tools, triangulating methods, right? Because I often thought, as the academic who was trying to explain decision making in crises, because that's what I kind of specialize in, you needed to take all the quantitative tools out there, and they're good, but by themselves they can't get there. You need qualitative information to provide context. And I've been reading stuff, and I don't want to criticize any particular person, but reading stuff saying we can give this real-time dynamic decision models for dynamic decision making to people kicking down doors. I'm like, good luck with that. You want to get them killed?
Yeah, those are dashboards. Those are called dashboard vendors.
Yeah.
John, we don't really have a disagreement. It may have sounded like it on models. I agree 100% with you, but I kind of think it goes to your point of their tools. They need to be evaluated for the particular tool and what they're telling you. And hopefully we have multiple tools that reinforce the same narrative. We're not depending on one tool to come up with the narrative. I think it's kind of and then you get to AI, it's kind of a branding problem, really. And that, the instant thing is, oh, there's a model, it must be right. I mean, now this isn't your head. This isn't my head. This is, say, the general public. They say, oh, this is a model, it must be right. Oh, it's AI. It must be, it must be smart. It's artificially intelligent. At least it's intelligent. In the absence, we don't have anything. So we don't have an answer. And I think that's where dangers start to sneak in, is we instantly trust too much without really understanding what the particular thing is doing.
Yeah, I think that's a normal pitfall, though. That's not just with AI. That's with everything else. I mean, and it's not always bad. Because if you look back at Graham Allison's work on the Cuban Missile Crisis, which, if you want to do decision theory and warning and how people negotiated, is worth reading, right? You want to look at alternative analysis, all those tools. He pointed out that the best decision is often not, the most accurate. The best decision is not timely. So you satisfice. We will take something that's good enough. Yep. And that's okay if you have context to know that's good enough. The problem here is we don't have the capacity to satisfy us because we don't know what these things mean, or we're misled. Or, I mean, I don't want to say people are inherently lazy, because some are, some aren't. I mean, I don't want to say one generation is inherently lazy vice another, because I'm sure my parents and grandparents' generation thought us baby boomers were a challenge too, right? It all depends. But you have to really look at how you use these information. And you're right. I don't think we disagree. We're just giving it from a different facet. We have to understand how the tools work, have realistic expectations. People can say, well, the biases on recognizing potential criminals in AI, visual recognition, have improved from 2014 to 2020. That's true. But if I'm like a black guy and it's going to come up and show you who's the burglar and he's a black guy every time, I'm not sure that's right. Because you know what? Right. I worked in South Central Los Angeles for decades. And I can tell you straight up that, a community that was once largely black, now it's largely Latino, but was once largely black, 99% of the people there were good people, hardworking, middle class, working class.
They don't want people breaking into their houses either. I mean,
exactly. So, I mean, we have misperception and biases that get pushed in there. So if we don't do this carefully, they come in. You can ask an AI, a generative AI, show me a picture of college professors, and they're all white guys like smoking pipes from like 19th century Europe, right? I mean, and they're counting out others. I mean, I prefer they put Hannah Arendt in there, because she was an outstanding theoretician of political conflict, of the type of things we see now. So we need to be very careful. But I don't want to come to a point where the caution says don't use these tools.
Right.
You need to use them, because one of the things I did at the Sheriff's Department, I teamed up with the Create Center. It was a counterterrorism research center at USC, and we got funding to look at using algorithmic game theory models for deployment of police, and we looked or sheriff's deputies, so law enforcement officers. So we looked at, could we better create the routes for conducting, because at that time we did barrier-free fare collection on a system. Could we find a better way to intervene with our fare checkers, our deputy sheriffs, and non-sworn security officers to check fares? And we went through and we developed an app. We put it on an iPhone, and and we would run tests. We would let the guys go off and do it themselves and see the detection rate. And then we looked at what the app told them to do, and the app was better than those guys. Then we said, can we do this with counterterrorism? Well, I run a large exercise. We got a bunch of human graduate students, paid them a little money to go to all these different stations on the line and tell us if they ever observed a cop. Because one of the complaints you get on transit systems is, we never see the police. Well, that's because it's a huge system and you're moving. Your likelihood of running into one is complicated. And some of these stations are huge, right? I mean, they have three levels, a mezzanine, a lower platform, an upper platform. They have, street access. You have one deputy sheriff or two deputy sheriffs or five, even if they're all there. And I can tell you they aren't always all there. That's why you have supervisors to keep them there and, encourage them. You're not going to see them. So we went in and ran an exercise taking different counterterrorism response people, canines, explosive detection canines, counterterrorism, armed personnel, regular uniformed personnel, and put them out there to see what happened. And we tried to randomize their appearance, because see, if it's not random, you turn up at the same place every day, your adversary who's doing a recon to determine where you are, to do their mission plan, is going to say, well, that cop is always here at Starbucks every morning because the cute counter girl's there. I'm going to go attack down the other end of the station at that time, for example. So we asked a team of sergeants, 30 years on, skilled people for doing deployment planning, come up with a model, deploy your guys, tell them where to go. We asked our app to do the same. And then we ran the exercises at different times of the day to compare them. Well, the app won. Sergeants were like, this is cool. That's one routine thing. And then the next phase is we wanted to take that and look at prevention of serious crime, as we did fare evasion. And we thought we would do that first because there was a lot of data, because we wanted to train the system. Then we did it with the counterterrorism teams. Then we're going to do it with serious crime, which is harder. And and not everyone appreciated it, because I had people kick back and say, well, we know how to deploy it. Why do we need a tool? Or you say the word randomization, and they had a view, well, we want intelligence to drive the deployment, not be random. I'm like, random, when we're talking about game theory, is not the same thing you think it is. But the bias was they didn't understand the terminology, right? So, I mean, you can
think of it as their Roomba going across the room, and they can't predict it, and it bothers the hell out of them. I know people like that. I mean, yeah.
And look what we do when you build that kind of algorithm, because look, Bayesian inference says we're going to run it this time, we're going to run it this time, and as the situation matures, this is a very simple version of it, because the statistics made people who don't do this stuff head hurt. It made a lot of leaders who are practical but aren't trained in the sciences to do it hard. But basically, it's going to learn, and it's going to look at this, and as it moves on, it's going to make better inferences. And what's the basis? That game theoretic Bayesian inference is the basis of one approach of addressing large language models. And over time, they get better. But there's always a confidence interval. It's not always going to be there, and that's where the human comes in. But so these things can be very powerful. They're very good tools, but they're just that. They're tools.
Yeah, and sometimes
John,
oh, sorry. Go ahead, Pete.
I want to jump in before we get too far away from some of these things. Stand by for the word smart going in front of any of these AI tools, smart AI or whatever, right? These are always tells that there's a lot of bullshit about. Yes. The other thing is, and look, this is my experience watching us abroad and how we do things. We are often the biggest problem. And so is there an appetite? Can law enforcement stomach, even at the lowest levels, an AI being trained on Sal Cassin's work? So Sal Cassin is an expert on false confessions that are pulled out, right? And so he's like, oh, hallmarks. And I've got these 5 hallmarks of when a case is absolutely good. The guy's going to be exonerated because there was a bullshit confession. Do we have use for AI to say, how do we improve our presence in the community and look at our own faults when we get things wrong? I mean, the next cop to lock onto the wrong guy and say, this is the guy, not going to be the last one, right? So how do we take AI and improve the force itself so that it can look itself square in the face and say, this is where we are making mistakes? Because that obviously happens.
It does.
But what do you think? I mean, because we often focus on threat, but let's focus on us and get us better.
I think we need to do that. I think that is a very good use of AI, and it's one that's going to take some time to vet and validate. But in the core, there is an ethical foundation, right? And ethics of guiding principles. So you want your cops to know, and the people who develop the technology to know, and when the decision makers who we support. And in this case, the prosecution, defense attorneys, all officers of the court, and the court. See, because one of the problems with generative AI as it stands now is we don't know how it reaches its decision. We don't know exactly which piece it's making its inference on. And to be able to, defend it in our system of justice, that's desirable. I don't think that doesn't mean you can't build an AI that can tell you how it reached its conclusion. In fact, for a lot of what we're doing, I think that's desirable. So I think what we want to do, we need to make it, our goals when having our ethics, it should be proportional. It should do no harm, right? And that's going to come together whenever you're doing any kind of targeting in a military sense. And not that cops target in the military sense, but there are similarities. It needs to be safe. It needs to be something that doesn't create a harm that's already there. So Asimov thought of that one, right? In his 3 laws of robotics. I think we could start there. I think it needs to be transparent, which I just talked to. It needs to show people how it did it, because transparency by itself, transparency is not the end state. Transparency is a precondition for legitimacy, and all military intervention and all policing requires legitimacy, relies upon trust of those we serve, the public and the government. And it has to be applicable. It has to be, universal. It has to be something that you can take across systems, not only work one time in one place. And it has to take into account the diversity of the community. You can't just work for old white guys. I say that because I'm an old white guy. I didn't know when I was going to get to the old part, but it came quicker than I thought. We need it to work, and I know that there's different viewpoints on diversity. The reality is diversity of thought, diversity of opinion helps limit bias. And bias is a cognitive failure that gets in the way of making good decisions. So yes, we need to do that. And the way to do that is to test it, look at it, create this together with the community. I remember when I first went to the Blue Line, which was a transit line in Los Angeles back in the late 80s. And I was the guy who developed the patrol deployment there. And we did a lot of things. We went and talked to community meetings. We went to talk to all the surrounding police stations. I got to know the gang enforcement guys, and we built a beautiful map of, where the gang's turf was in correspondence to the line in neighborhoods. And then I said to the cops, I said, we need to understand the community. And the response was, well, how do we do that? I'm like, let's do a survey. Let's go off and talk to people that, ride the train and are in the community. And the cops were skeptical. They hadn't done that. They're like, we ain't going to do that. I'm like, give it a chance. Try it. After a few weeks of cops getting out there, administering a survey to the community and the riders on the train, they came back. They forgot that I suggested it. It was now their idea. They said, we have good ideas on how to put bad guys in jail. And I'm like, well, cool. How'd you do that? They're like, here's what the survey said. So, I mean, you have to, that's a long way of saying you have to engage the people who are going to use the technology with the development of the technology. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they're going to throw it in a radio car. They're going to, who knows? They're going to shoot it. They're going to drop it off a bridge. I mean, all kinds of things you've seen infantry guys do with stuff they don't want in their kit, right? And the same things with cops. But if you incorporate them into the process to develop it and help them to develop the ethics, because by and large, 99, it's like Ivy Soap, 99.98% of cops are ethical. They didn't go into this business because they wanted to be thugs. Now some do.
Right.
We catch them and we put them in prison is the goal. But you want to bring in all those stakeholders. And, I would argue sometimes if you're working in a justice system, some of your stakeholders are the criminals too. They have insight into how they got caught. They have insight into, usually if they've been there for a while, how they may have wanted a different way of life. If you want to sense reality, to replicate reality, you have to bring in everybody who plays.
John, I've got a clarifying question for you. When you're gathering evidence, obviously, if it's used in a court of law, it has to be admissible, and there are all sorts of very strict rules around that. But sometimes there are things that come in that aren't admissible, and on a parallel path, you could find the admissible thing. How often does that happen, or do investigators work with only admissible evidence because everything's reviewed by the court?
Well, that's a difficult and complicated question. There are times when you conduct intelligence operations, for example, there are means and things that you don't often disclose and things that you won't bring to court. And there's a thing, they call that the wall, the dividing line between intelligence and law enforcement. And to protect the sources, which may be foreign sources where the same rules don't apply, you will point someone in a direction, say, go forward and find, this is a person of interest, we think they're involved, and let them build a case independently. That's fair. That's, been done. The problem when, if not applied properly with a good community oversight, it can damage the trust in the community, particularly if it looks like you're targeting only one segment of the community. So yes, you have to, there are things that come in that may give you intuition, right? Like, I think that guy's a bad guy, but I don't have enough. So you watch, you monitor. That's an example at the very low level. The question is, if you want to prosecute somebody, it has to be all lawful. I worked for Sherman Block, who was probably one of the great sheriffs of modern era in Los Angeles. His go-to phrase at the time was, you don't break the law to enforce the law. And I've worked later for other people that said, let's work the gray area. I'm like, well, the gray area is only gray if it's incidental. If you know you're working it, it's no longer gray. And this doesn't go transcends law enforcement, because to be able to use these weapons or new weapon systems that conform with international humanitarian law, they have to be tested, vetted, and understood. And there has to be an ethical framework. You just can't come in with a novel tool, use it.
Right.
You have to determine because there has to be appropriate distinction and proportionality in a warfighting sense. And ethics and the law aren't absent in warfare. Where they become complicated is when you come into domestic space, and sometimes those two interface, like dealing with terrorists, for example. And like, there are some people, it's a classic ethical question, and it's a legal question, and it's one of efficiency and operational integrity. Do you torture somebody to find out where the next attack is going to occur? Now, there's a whole body of evidence, and they're still litigating this in Guantanamo Bay as we speak, to some degree. There's a whole body of evidence that says when you torture people to give you information, they're going to tell you whatever you want, and the information you get is likely to be tainted. Notwithstanding watching Chicago PD or 24, and people are like, yes, we're going to do that. Now, I don't personally believe violating the law, torturing people, which is a violation of, the Geneva Conventions. Like, you can't do that. Doesn't mean it's not done, and it's and it doesn't mean it has never proven to be the truth. The question is, if it denies you your legitimacy, was it worth it? And that's an individual question. I would say that if it was ever valid, it was a severe exception to the rules, and you're better off in your rules of engagement saying, and we're not going to violate international humanitarian law. That doesn't mean that there's going to be incidental effects, because like, even with distinction, you can sometimes bleed over. But you have to then start to say, was your targeting process rigorous? Was it adapted? Was the distinction appropriate? And even when there's incidental effects, you have to say, is it proportional, right?
I'd be more concerned with something. I mean, obviously torture. Like let's take that off the table. That's probably not. Let's hope it's off the table, right?
Well, it has in the past. It hasn't been, but yeah.
But let's say right. But let's say you're talking about something like, I don't know, license plate readers, and the license plate reader places 100 people at this store that was, or near this, in the proximity of this store that was robbed, and maybe that's not in itself admissible in court. But and I'm just saying this hypothetically, it might actually be. But I'm saying it's kind of like you went to a private license reader company, bought this data, and got your 100 potential people who might be suspects. You run those through cameras or something, and you find that 4 of those people were actually at the site that you found from the license plate reader. Not that camera thing might actually be admissible because it's got, it's tested technology. It's in a particular place. It isolates them to, 5 square feet from the store, whatever else. At that point that's sort of the distinction I'm talking about there. AI, of course, is all about, do we have data that we can analyze, and do we have algorithms to analyze it? Right. I mean, that's
right.
basically what it is. So if we're collecting data in this way that kind of points us to other data, is that something that law enforcement are doing, that maybe it would be out of bounds from the evidentiary point of view, but it's certainly not out of bounds from an investigatory point of view?
I think the investigative side, before you detain somebody, because all this is to protect individuals' rights, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're collecting broad data to determine who may be there, that's fine. If you use that as your sole criterion,
right,
for making an arrest, well, then you're not going to get.
Yeah, you can't do that. Yeah, that's not going to stand up.
So you have to know how to balance it. You have to have an ethical framework to deal with that. You have to have guidance. Like, you can't just decide, we're going to stop this one class of person in this neighborhood because, and we're going to kick them off the train, or we're going to pull them over and not let them come into the city because that type of person commits crimes. It's like, well, how do you know that? How do you know that type of person actually fits what you want? So you have to be very careful.
And it sounds like we have the ethical framework in place for human processes, and
yes,
we should certainly apply those to our AI processes. So if the AI thing is saying, kick everybody with slight gray hair on the sides because they didn't color it very good that day, off the train, you're going to be able to say, okay, that AI can't do that. I'm going to ignore that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's why human in the loop helps, because it gives context, but it also gives accountability. Because how do you hold an algorithm accountable?
Well, and here's another thing, getting back to sort of my earlier points about models and whatever else, is we often fall back, and I'm not saying in law enforcement, I'm saying just people who have to make decisions. They often fall back and say, hey, the computer did it, right? Or the algorithm did it, the AI did this, rather than I'm responsible for interpreting this, or I was responsible for purchasing this and making these decisions. Now you can blame the AI. You don't have to blame a person.
Yes, that you're right. I'll tell you what, I mentor a bunch of young doctoral students, graduate students, and I'll be reviewing their work, and I'm like, you've got 15 citation formats in one report. Which style are you using? And they're like, an AI, and I won't mention the brand name. I don't want to get sued or to get a cease and desist letter. Well, I used X template for doing that. I'm like, garbage in, garbage out, dude. Right. It's up to you to review your work. That's a time-saving measure. The final product, that's on you. And that's the same with law enforcement, anything else.
And this is absolutely not a new problem. Example I like to give, 1987, I'm a junior in high school. I applied to UC Berkeley for their, come here for part of your senior year kind of thing. And I get a letter that says, you're accepted. You're going to be doing this. I open the letter. I'm all excited and everything else. Like literally within 15 minutes, like they had a camera on me and we're watching. We get a call from the admissions office at UC Berkeley. Our computer sent the letters out by a mistake. And I was, 16 years old at the time. I was on top of my game enough to say, okay, no, your computer did not make a mistake. Somebody there made a mistake, but I guess I won't be going. It's the problem is as old as computers involved in things.
And all of these problems are old. When people talk about corruption, hold on a second.
Sure.
Someone's getting rowdy out there, Brad. My AI says that something crazy is going on. All right, got John back.
one of the rules is if I'm on a Zoom call, especially if it's going to be broadcast, the gardener comes at the leaf blower every time. I don't know how that is, but it's one of Murphy's laws. You know, it's the new one. Yes, this is old. When we talk about corruption, or we talk about, like, I do a lot of work on criminal armed groups, and people are like astounded that a criminal enterprise starts to provide governance in a community. I'm like, well, how do you think government started in the first place? You know,
Keep the peace.
Yeah, and when you see, name the Mexican drug cartel or the gang in Brazil that starts to have those functions, because it enables them to do their business, right?
Mhm.
They get trapped by legitimacy. This isn't new. I remember I first wrote I was the theoretical guy behind criminal insurgency. I first read it. Half the people loved it. The other half thought I was nuts. Now it's more people think it's correct or not. And people are like, now saying, hey, we've determined that cartels can have political dimensions. I'm like, when do you figure that out? Julius Caesar knew that.
Yeah.
But, it's just the nature of human stuff. We don't have good memory. That's one of the things that I think automating, and it's maybe a bad term, but having a synthetic decision environment, which is what we're really talking about when you do this beyond individual applications, a synthetic decision environment, which is able to bring a range of tools together to allow you to do alternate course of action development, test hypotheses, war game, train people how to conduct. I often like to grab McCraven's laws of special operations and apply them to what we do.
Mhm.
And then collect all that, do an after action. And then I'm like, if we go through this entire process, we use it for planning, we use it as an operational tool when we do it. And when we start to uncover war crimes, all right, because you have to do an after action. Whenever you use lethal force in an international humanitarian law and international human rights law context, it's kind of a norm to do an after action. How did it work? Did we protect who we did or not? I think you can automate a lot of that and then say, hey, and this was where we made these mistakes. Let's not do that again. This is where we did it really good. Well, let's reinforce that training. And oh, by the way, these guys committed a war crime or an atrocity. Name which one it is, who's party to what treaty, where it goes, and then have the AI help you generate the prosecutor's brief to deliver to the appropriate court of jurisdiction.
Right.
Which multiple courts.
Yeah. Two things there. A lot of times practitioners get, tunnel vision on what their practice is rather than, hey, these are big problems that human beings have already solved before. It's just the same here with different names and different numbers attached to it. And then the second one is in automation. Automation is probably my specialty, going back, I don't know, my whole career. In automation, what's important is not to just, make something so you flip a switch and it does it. That's absolutely not the point. The point of automation is to capture knowledge and capture what human beings do. And part of good automation is to always be testing that your automation and that knowledge, and when it changes, updating it, and when the automation drifts away from the knowledge that you have, well, updating the automation, bring it back in line. And that sounds exactly like you're talking about, like with post-action reports, et cetera. These are human activities that need to be done to look at the data and see if we're executing these things the right way, and then remediate from there.
Yes, and that has to be the case.
And that's a full cycle. That is the full cycle of automation. There's a lot of automators who will tell you, oh no, we automated it, let's move on to the next thing. Yeah, absolutely not. And that's a problem we're going to hit with AI as well. It's, oh, we made an AI for that, it's solved. No, it's not.
Exactly. Well, when I did a lot of emergency operations and planning for complex stuff, supporting not just the sheriff's department, but the entire county of LA's, emergency infrastructure back in the day. And there were some people who didn't apply themselves to the degree they wanted, or decision makers I worked for who weren't interested in terrorism will never happen. Well, I can show you that probably was a bad decision. I would always, because I was always involved in decision support in one way or another, usually supporting, in some cases directly to the sheriff, other elected officials. And I say, here's the deal. You may not be interested in this, But when it fails and the disaster will occur, terrorism will occur, they're going to seat the civil grand jury and conduct an investigation to see why it failed. And you're an elected official or you're an appointed official. Either way, you're going to be, as to use the technical term, ass out, right? Because if you do not go through all your due diligence, prepare your subordinate leaders, equip them with the proper tools, train them to what's lawful, ethical, practical, when it hits the fan, it's on you, whether you want it to be or not, you know? And I've seen, sadly, more than one executive or C-suite, you know, if you're in the civilian world, leader get jammed up, you know.
Yeah.
And a couple that I worked for go to prison, you know. Federal prison is not a good place to go if you're a law enforcement executive, I'm thinking.
You know, and CYA is like the second biggest motivation of anything. Like, not to be able to convince them to just keep yourself covered. That should be an easy fight, and it sounds like it's not.
Well, when I first went into police work, corruption was a big issue. If you remember the Knapp Commission, Whitman Knapp in New York, and you know Frank Serpico, and all those scenarios, and I would have thought, and I was wrong, that would have been a big enough example to policing in America that we need to root out corruption. Except for there's been 3 major commissions, you know, in New York after that. We've had at least 3 for my period of time here in Los Angeles. I've worked with cops in, you know, the Metropolitan Police in London. The font of modern policing has a significant trust issue over how they interact with the community, their use of undercover operations and ethics. The Sydney Police Department, you know, Sydney, Australia, the New South Wales Police Department, numerous royal commissions looking into where they are. These are perennial issues. They keep coming back. You know, you can't just mow the lawn and hope they go away. Same with terrorism. I can remember, you know, I worked terrorism, counterterrorism before 9/11. Started right after the 92 riots in LA. And so I was there for, you know, the Om Chimiko attack and the attack in the Murrah building and all the East Africa bombings that told us Al-Qaeda was coming. And then Al-Qaeda is coming. Let's not do this right-wing extremism stuff anymore. It's not important. Al-Qaeda attacks, and then ISIS splits. We don't have to do Al-Qaeda anymore. It's like, well, they can go away. And they've already gotten rid of the right-wing extremist guys. Now they're like, hey, they're right-wing extremists. It's like, well, where'd you think they went? You know, you didn't put them all in jail. You didn't change human nature. Oh, by the way, now we have polycrisis because we got Al-Qaeda, ISIS, right-wing extremists, start adding the environmentalist guys. And now we got to sort among all of these. And guess what? There are a whole group, a constellation of organized crime enterprises that interact with these guys. It's not the same, but they interact. I did an analysis, a social network analysis, looking at the 2 major criminal enterprises in Mexico, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación and the Sinaloa cartel, or the Cartel de Sinaloa. And in between those 2 constellations, and they're networks, so they're not just a single unitary entity. There's dozens, hundreds of subordinate cliques and gangs and affiliates, which they have alliances or different, you know, arrangements for fealty. In between, there's this constellation that serves both. They're middlemen. Guess who they serve? Anybody who has money.
Yeah.
And
too bad you can't pick them out like influencers on TikTok or something. That would be kind of convenient. I
think you can if you do your due diligence, you do it long enough. The problem is everybody wants the immediate fix. Like we call it the Kingpin problem. We're going to go take out El Chapo. It's like, well, you think the number 2, 3 guys ain't been trying to take him out anyway?
Yeah, they have the whole idea of next man up too. I mean, it's not just us. It's not just people who played football. That's for sure.
You know, so I think you need to look at the entire ecosystem, and you have to look at yourself, your own organization, and look how these things interact. You know, because you have October 7th, what appears to be some combination of intelligence failure, operational failure, blindness of one sort or another, myopia, occur with the Hamas attack on Israel. Dreadful attack. Some people are now starting to resign because I guess they're seeing the accountability phase. Immediately after that, I'm like, let's start looking about where they may do their second or third order attacks here in the Western Hemisphere. And in my mind, I start thinking, I think Brazil and Argentina come to mind. Why? Because I know that Hamas, Hezbollah have operated down there in the past in their relationships, and another case. You do this stuff long enough, you regret accurate intelligence forecasts. Because I've made a couple of them. I wish I had been wrong. And I'm like, a month later, 6 weeks later, they hook up a bunch of operatives who are looking to do attacks right down there in Argentina and Brazil. Well, not a surprise. They've done it there before, right? There's a whole history of them operating down there, and they use a lot of that as their financial hub. There's a further projection to that hasn't come to fruit yet. I hope it doesn't. But you have to look at this. But these are examples of where AI can help you sort it. Second, remember, I've been doing counterterrorism since 1978.
Yeah,
just a couple of years, right?
You're not looking for a giant industry either. You're looking for literal needles in haystacks. It's five guys. Five guys can fly. How many were there in 9/11? Was it 5? Was it 8? Whatever it was. They can take 4 planes and do terrible things with them. Yeah, they can. And there are indicators, and people say we need to connect the dots. Like I said, it's hard to connect them before they've happened. Yeah.
That doesn't mean you can't, using the large body of data, knowing how these things flow, create points that you may want to monitor. I mean, there are things. I'm not saying you can't do this.
Let me give you a scenario and see what you think of this. This would be sort of future looking. I doubt anybody has thought of this at this point. But let's say there was an LLM that you had, I don't know, somehow you had trained it on lots of these terrible people. In addition to like an ability to speak a language, right? You need a good base level for that, but you've also trained it on, like a whole bunch of extremists. And so maybe you also have data on, like everybody in the United States. Let's say you had some sort of data on everybody in the United States, and you tell the LLM, find me 3 people who could pull off such and such an endeavor, maybe taking down a building or something like that. Show me what a hypothetical conversation between them might be. And so you generate these, and maybe you generate millions and millions of these. But let's say that somehow, because of how this comes out, 5 or 6 of them are like really magical. Like the LLM comes out with something amazing. Do you think that might be a future of using generative AI? Given all the data we have, like look at possibilities and then look at the ones that turn out to be, hey, maybe we need to look at this a little bit more because this is like more than possible. This is at least a good Disney movie.
No, I think there's something there. It goes back to my digital sandbox, a place to play and experiment. We're not going to apply this to individuals.
Right.
There's human rights considerations. There's ethical. I mean, you don't want to do things inherently that are unethical because then that pollutes your own organization.
Right.
That's one of the problems with disinformation. It pollutes the entire infosphere, right? So you want to be very careful about that. But to kick around alternative possibilities and look at how groups may come together. Like I did a bunch of work for the U.S. government a bunch of years ago on what the emergence of new groups would look like. And what we did to do that was bring in a series of experts, and their names, if I mention, you know who they are, but I can't in this forum. But we were able to say, okay, these are things that happen when a new group emerge, or how do groups change their, how do they fragment? I just published a paper with a couple of colleagues on looking at the fragmentation of Mexican drug cartels in the future. We ran alternate scenarios. Now, time will tell how accurate these were, but we basically, applied, AI algorithmic tools, if you will. I mean, I think algorithmic tools are better than AI because it's misleading, but we applied the algorithms to it, and we came up with some plausible solutions. I think that's useful. I think it's useful for training analysts on how to look at things. Because I used to do giant link charts, like 6x6 on the wall, micro things like.
Yeah, becoming an analyst at anything, you have to have reps. It's all about reps. And if there's only like 5 or 6 reps in the historical record, there's just not a lot to study. You need to come up with things that they can try to hone their skills.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why you practice.
But the other thing to keep in mind, and this is more the organization of how you run an analytical team, because I've run teams of collectors and analysts, and I think there's value in interacting both of those, which tend to sometimes be in silos. But sometimes when you put your team together, you use a lot of experts. So I'm going to want an expert. Say we're doing Al Qaeda, just because it's simple. So I'm going to want guys that are familiar with Al Qaeda, know them in and out. Then I'm going to want to go step out and I want to have people that are familiar with the Muslim Brotherhood, because that feeds into the entire ethos there, right? But then I'm going to want a generalist, somebody that doesn't work Al Qaeda. See, because what happens with experts is they get blinded by past. They can't do that. They won't do that. Well, they didn't do that because it didn't meet their objective. Like, why haven't they attacked the United States? Because even when they had the potential capability, and we know that they've tried, and we've interdicted some, that's always cool. But why didn't they do it? It's a combination of us inhibiting them, or it didn't meet their strategic objective, right? Like, why do your enemies work? If they're failing, don't help them, right? So what we need to do is have a generalist who's gonna say, they're not going to do that because they never have, but doesn't know better, right? Because remember, when you were a young officer, a young scholar, you didn't know better, and you came up with insights because an experienced guy wouldn't do that. You didn't know enough not to do that. So maybe you bring generalists in to do your indication as part of your indications and warning process, right? Because they're not going to say, "Oh yeah, the last 5 times they did that, it was just a chow run." They're going to say, "I think I see something." And let's look at it. So I think putting your team together with a blend of experiences, different disciplines, helps. Like when I did a site assessment for one big national gathering, and I brought along a fire battalion chief that was part of my analytical cell. And I'll tell you what, I was a cop. What was I looking for? The high points, lines of fire. He walks in, he's like, "Where are the fire hydrants?" I would have never, as a cop, that's not part of your thing, but they become very important if you're going to start having to do mass decon operations after a chemical attack, right? So maybe you mix up your team. That's why diversity in your analytical process is important. And if you're using artificial agents to do that, maybe using different agents to look at different pieces and then comparing results is a good idea. Like one of the things I'm doing now, we're trying to build a private generative AI component for this synthetic decision environment. I'm trying to experimentally, incrementally build. Well, we're challenging like a dozen different large language models to see how they function on the same set of questions, right? Just to see how, we're at the point now where we don't need the right answer yet. We just want to understand what's there. And that's the first step is to explore. What can AI do for policing? Well, let's get the analysts together with some seasoned detectives, with some line police decision makers, watch commanders who have to make crisis decisions every day. Let's bring in the SWAT team guys and see what we can do and move it together. But you see a lot of things. Go ahead.
Oh no, make your point, because I want to ask another question.
Okay, because a lot of things, like a lot of what I'm doing right now is building on the GeoInt foundation. It's taking geospatial information, GIS systems, smart cities tools, integrating sensors. So I've been doing a lot of work with small UAS, and I'm beginning to think we need to go beyond. Not beginning to think. I think we need to go beyond that and look at unmanned maritime vessels, particularly in dealing with the littoral space, because that's important. And looking at when the two come together. As we do that, we're using 3D, starting to develop 3D digital twins of real built infrastructure to see what's there. Because part of if you're an infantry guy and you or you're a commander, you're going to do a walk of the area you may operate in, right? The reason why you do battle rides to see how terrain influences operations. Well, terrain, weather, and enemy are the 3 cores of all this. You have to understand all. So we're starting to look at building digital twins and then wiring the sensors into them, right? So now we can do 3D representation of, I don't know, pick a transportation center, pick a big building, pick a large public gathering like, a sports venue or something, and then looking at the feeds that are always there. And now you can start to, when you understand it, where the choke points are. You can do an analysis of, decisive points and, the entire operational environment, so intelligence preparation for operations, you might call it in the civil world, and then use those as tools. The question is, how quick can you do that for dynamic decision making? And yes, you can do heads up displays, and yeah, you can give augmented reality, and those are coming. My understanding is that the Chinese are doing a lot more of it than we are. My understanding, and this is truly scary because I think it's an emerging potential, is so are organized crime groups.
Mm-hmm.
And they're using it maybe in the areas where they make the most money. So they're modeling financial illicit flows and financial flows to see where they can caper in that space, so that hits that middleman thing. So if we can understand that, part of understanding how we can use our technologies is understanding how our adversaries do.
Mm-hmm.
So
one of the things I wanted to ask you about, it seems like as technology emerges, there's two areas where the drivers of innovation really are. And one is porn, probably not applicable in this place, but also there's the legal side, right? And so I'm going to pick on a couple of police forces here. Vallejo cannot seem to reliably keep itself out of court and getting sued for millions and millions of dollars 2 times in the last 10 years. That's hyper expensive. When you talk about so now that monitoring police stops has been democratized and anybody can have a camera on them at any time, it gets really hard for the police to know the law well enough, because the person who's seeking out that engagement probably knows the law and they're looking for a payday. So if I'm running a police force, I'm going to say, Brad, help me help my people on the ground. And some of these guys are probational cops, right? They don't know enough to know enough. Like, let's understand when you watch all these auditing videos, it's like, hey, I've got a right to be here. It's a public space.
And they do.
And they do, right? And there's the cop, like, how about I body slam you? And you're like, oh my God, if I'm a chief, I'm like, we got to stop that. So it seems to me that there's an application with AI where I can just have a bunch of prompts set up and say, all right, here's how we're going to deal with this. One, keeps my supervisor supervising instead of in the field directly. But what are your guys' thoughts on building something that reduces legal risk and helps to provide, like, even if it's like in Vallejo, there was a kid, gang related, got a gun in his lap, passes out at the Taco Bell, right? The ultimate solution was to shoot this kid 30 times, right? And so he's dead. Right, millions of dollars of lawsuits. So while they're responding to this, because it wasn't like respond to an imminent threat, it was, this is a threat. It probably, I don't know how you get out of this thing without killing this kid, but how about having like the tactical cell say, hey, we're going to work on some prompts and try to get you guys some outcomes and some solutions and some whatevers, because we want to keep this kid alive. We don't want to get sued for millions of dollars. How do we make better decisions? Is there room for that in AI?
Yeah, this is something where you could have your friend Will Riley on, and I mean, Will could probably find the data on body cams. And the big surprise with body cams is not so much that it opened police departments up to more lawsuits. It's that they solved these problems. Like having a video record of it actually solved the problem before it happened. That you really didn't have a high incidence of these, and so you didn't have activists coming after police departments when there was body cam evidence involved. And that's actually a very quick win if you think about it. Like a decade, that's a big win. Yeah, no AI involved at all.
And you're right. And the cop who does not know the law and goes there and intervenes in an inappropriate way is not new. I can remember.
Yeah.
I've seen this more than once, and when I was a watch commander, I saw it way too many times. And then I would call into my sergeants because I'd watch the video, I'd see it, I'd get the complaint, and I'm like, call them in. I'd say, you know what? You're not supervising your guys properly because they're inappropriately applying the law. You can't just tell somebody they can't exercise their First Amendment right, take their camera and throw it down the sewer. And it's certainly what made you think it could do that on camera. But and then you get the guy saying, I can do that. It's like, no, you can't. It's unlawful. I used to keep the case law, for the U.S. Supreme Court, the Fifth Circuit, the Ninth Circuit where we live, and I show them, here's what the law is. Every time I see it on TV, I cringe because I've talked to the U.S. attorney, because one of the things they do when they start looking at this is they call the sheriff, and the sheriff then comes downhill, and somehow it always wind up at my desk. And it's like, okay, I start keeping the law, pull people in and saying, now we're going to train you guys to understand what's lawful, what's there. And in many of those cases, there was a lawful way to deal with it. They just didn't know the law. there's a particular Ninth Circuit case where you couldn't tell the guy you can't video and just do it, but if there are actually inhibited interfering with your operation, you could have won it a different way. They just didn't have the decision tree to do the differential diagnosis. You can train people. AI in a synthetic training environment, which was like the first way I get into this stuff, because we were looking at using AI back when I was a tactical medic to be able to train us how to do, trauma intervention and be more effective. And then maybe have the virtual reach back to like a trauma surgeon, so you're in the field and you can reach back. But you can certainly train people based upon these scenarios and run them through alternatives and give them the decision point where it's lawful, where it's not. But the core there is you got to train cops to know the law better.
And have the AI actually generate it can generate a myriad of situation scenarios that people can respond to, correctly. I mean, just being able to have the reps is
muscle memory. That's what you do at the range every time you go shoot, right? I mean,
I come up with a scenario. Hey, these you guys are robbing me. Pow, pow, pow.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can clear a 92F. I don't even think about it anymore. It just goes, right?
Right.
And I've been retired for years. I can still do that, because it's ingrained. Yes, you can use it as tools to do it. You could build it. The bottom, and it can help you understand the gaps in the law, the evolving places in the law, because there are things that you don't know are illegal until you have to figure out. Well, one,
you got to imagine it, yeah.
And then you have to say, okay, how can we do that? Find the gaps in the law so you can build them and build them effectively. So yeah, great application, great tools. It's kind of predictive policing is definitely one avenue where AI has great potential to do intelligence-led policing, identify hotspots, understand past interventions in hotspots, anticipate the balloon effect. Like if I close down this open air drug market, where are these guys going to go? Because they're not going to stop selling drugs, right? So where are they going to go? So can I start reinforcing policing these areas? How can I avoid over securitization? Because one of the things we like to do when there's a crime spree or a critical event, because we're reactive, right? We'll flood all the cops where that attack occurred to make everybody feel safe. Well, that's cool, except for maybe now you elevate fear because everyone's like, there's a whole lot of cops here. There must be something wrong. So maybe you anticipate where those balloon effects going to go and where you're going to displace them and distribute your cops so they're available. That's that kind of randomization, true randomization in a game theory sense. So yeah, there's lots of application, but to make any technology work, you have to train the human operator to understand what they're doing. And I prefer the knowledge first approach to the data first approach, but in reality, you got to blend the two. So which means that now we have to train leaders to know what AI can and can't do. We have to know what the law is, and we have to train it. It's not good enough to train the police chief or the sheriff, because chances are they're not the guy knocking on the door
it's not the cops who come up with the idea of speed cameras. It's always the revenue chasing city council people. I mean, that's documented 100, over and over and over. But you know what I love about your approach, John? I'll tell you this, because I think we're getting close to where Pete wants to wrap this up, is you're not just looking at, the AI. It's not just this, amorphous thing. It is a set of tools. They have particular uses, getting, just as you mentioned before, knowledge or data. That's a decision that's below the tool use. It's like we're going to use these tools and we're going to focus on knowledge, rather than data. I mean, it's a refinement of those things. It's a very, very smart approach. It always involves human beings. Human beings have got to be the decision makers. We're not talking about a world yet where we're going to trust automation to make big decisions. Absolutely not. And that's where the state of the art is. And that's a good place for it to be and for it to remain, that we're thoughtful about this stuff.
Agree.
Is there anything you guys want to close on? Either one of you have any points to make, or should we wrap this thing up?
I made mine.
Good. John?
Yeah, the only thing I'd say, and I think collectively we've hit it, is this is a iterative development. AI, I caution that we don't want to believe it's solved everything, because it hasn't. But what AI is going to be capable of doing, there's going to be new insights that occur from that human AI interface that loyal wingman is running out there any day now, that we don't see yet, and we're not going to see it till it occurs. We're going to know that there's an entire emerging legal framework that has to come there, and the problem is going to come before the law because the law is reactive. Not that there are people trying to anticipate this, there already are at the international level, not as many at the local level because of resource constraints. But
are you generally impressed with where they're going with that, or do you think they're even hitting the mark?
I think they're close. I mean, I've sat with. I think the ICRC has International Committee of the Red Cross has some very good, solid lawyers with operational experience that address these issues well. I think the European Union may be ahead of us regulatorily.
They're certainly ahead in the attempt. I think they're
have they solved it yet? No. You solve it by working at it. The ICRC is getting there. The International Law Commission that looks at how IHL goes, they're getting there. Remember, the law is incremental and it's like Swiss cheese, right? Knowing how it works. We're not as good domestically. There's questions right now, and they're going to come before the Supreme Court about how we collect and use data and how you can purchase data from private entities.
Right. I mean, there's even questions on copyright and even getting into what look like European artist rights, that are going to hit the Supreme Court just in terms of training models, which is big things to solve. Absolutely.
And I hope as an primary operator who looks at crisis decision making in conflict, right, both civil and military, and the gap between the two, because that's where I specialize is in the seams. I hope that we bring operators together with the lawyers and the lawmakers to solve these. Because if you come with the ideal, we don't want any of this, well, that's not realistic, or we want everything to go, that's not realistic either. You have to test it, and it's, in my mind, you test it hopefully through wargaming, through decision making, tactical decision making, operation decision making exercises to see what works, how it's most effective, and always adheres to basic human rights law. That doesn't change. And the European framework and our framework, we use different terms to describe it, but we talk about the same things. So we need to find ways to make sure we do that, because the thing that allows government to function when it functions well, and there's obviously debates about how well and where, but the things that allow you to do that is public trust. When the public believes the government's legitimate, it allows the government to function. You police the consent of the public. And I don't think we can forget that. And
same with private uses of AI as well. When the public believes that the private industry is developing these things in a way that align with their interest, it's great. When they, if they see different, they're not going to be so supportive of it. And I think it's a very similar problem. Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say is sometimes this is complicated by foreign intelligence services who pollute the atmosphere with disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. And that is very, very hard to rule out, because how do you balance, human rights and freedom of expression with reality? And AI is in the middle of this. AI is used as a tool to destabilize governments. Sure. AI can also be the early warning sentinel to tell you that people are trying that. So you're really, and this is the thing I think strikes me after like 40 years in the police service trying to do this right. It's all a matter of striking balance between the law and the community and safety. You can't have one or the other. You have to balance. That takes work.
Yeah. Man, that's great stuff. Fellas, I appreciate you guys so much. Hang around a second. We'll wrap up on the backside, but let me run the credits and turn this thing off. Thanks, everybody.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much